Alright, so I'm just gonna review this magazine. It is a special edition of People magazine, and its focus is true crime stories. So, I don't typically read People magazine. In fact, I could not care less about, celebrity culture and Hollywood and fame. I just don't care. But my husband stopped at the grocery store for ice cream on our way home one night, and he knows that I love magazines, but I typically go for a cooking magazine or an interior design magazine because I love interior design. But I also really enjoy true crime and reading about all of the amazing ways that detectives and investigators are able to catch evil, wicked criminals. So, this particular magazine is all about that. And while I was somewhat familiar with some of the cases that this true crime special edition showcases, there were some that I didn't know very much about or that I actually had not even heard of. So I'm going to just go through and tell you about the articles that are inside of this. So the first one, and I'll just say that it's sort of separated into what it calls chapters, but there's not a substantial written out portion or article. It's predominantly pictures and a few paragraphs for the most part. So the first chapter it calls Killer in the Family, and if you are at all familiar with true crime, then you have probably heard about the Chris Watts case where he killed his wife and his 2 young daughters. So there is a special feature about that one, but it just kind of talks in general about that case. It doesn't go too deeply into it. And then there is another family-related article after the Chris Watts one, and this one took place in 1982, and I had not heard of this one, but it took place in Wisconsin, and I don't really remember that much about it. Oh yes, it says, for nearly 4 decades, the vicious murder of Barbara Mendez went unsolved, but with help from the Oxygen series, Cold Justice. It's about an episode of Cold Justice. Her husband was finally convicted, and her daughters found closure. So it was another killer in the family. So there's a couple of pages about that one. And then the next article is about that young lady whose friend murdered her after she gave birth to her daughter. That one's kind of sad. I don't like ones where women are the killers. So the next chapter then begins, and it says, unmasked by DNA. And I really liked this chapter because most of it is about the Golden State Killer. And I recently read a whole book about the Golden State Killer. And no, it was not McNamara's book. I will be reading that one soon. The one called I'll Be Gone in the Dark. But it was another one that talks about the DNA aspect of catching the killer. So I really liked this section because it put some pictures to things that I had only had my own imagination of. So I got to see some photographs of things, and that was interesting. So that there was quite a long section about catching the Golden State Killer. And then there was an unsolved crime after that, but that there was a DNA for that they're hopeful to be able to figure out. And that one was about the murder of a woman named Sherry Black inside of her own bookstore. So that one's kind of sad it's not solved. Chapter 3 was probably my favorite chapter, and it was called Amazing Escapes. And this one was especially amazing to me because it talked about the Jamie Kloss case where she had been abducted by this guy, and she survives. She was held captive for almost 3 months, and she managed to escape. So that one was very uplifting, reading about her finding her way back to her family. So Amazing Escapes was an interesting chapter. There was a section in there about that family in California that were abusing all their kids, and they had quite a few. I think it was 11 or 12 kids that they were like homeschooling, and that they were abusing really badly. Now, I will say, this is kind of an aside, but I am very supportive of homeschooling, and I don't like the way that the media took that case and made it a case against homeschooling. Obviously, evil people can use something like homeschooling as a way to stay under the radar and to abuse their children. But I do think that in the hands of a loving parent, homeschooling is just as good, if not better, than public school. So that's a little aside. Obviously, people who are not capable of being kind to their children have other problems beyond just like homeschooling. Okay, so back to this article, or rather this magazine. The next little section is about Jehovah's Witnesses cover-up of child molestation, which is just dreadful. It's a really sad topic. So there's that one. And then there's an article that follows up with the women who had been abducted and held captive for different lengths of time. And there's quite a few follow-ups. So there's the Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Gina DeJesus one. And they follow up with all three of those ladies who were held captive together. And then there's also several others. The more recent one, in 2016 with Kayla Brown, where she was found in that shipping container. And yeah, there's a couple other ones that I don't really know too much about. JC Dugard, and another one that I actually had never heard of. And it was Alicia. I'm afraid to pronounce this. I'm afraid I'm going to say it wrong, but it's Alicia Kozakowicz. I probably said that incorrectly. But she was kidnapped. Here, I'll read you this one, because this one was shocking to me. I'd never heard of this. So it says, little was known about video streaming in the dark web in 2002 when 13-year-old Alicia Kozakowicz was abducted outside her Pittsburgh home by a 38-year-old Virginia man she met in an internet chat room. And then it goes on to describe the abuse she suffered in somewhat graphic detail, but it also says that that whole process was streamed on video. And I'll continue reading. She was rescued by FBI agents, tipped by an apparently guilt-ridden Florida man who recognized from news stories the teen captive he saw in the illegal live stream. Tech-savvy agents were then able to trace her tormentor's screen name to his home. So they were able to catch him and save her. So that was pretty amazing. So after that section, chapter 4, the next section is called Case Gone Cold. And there are a couple of different cold cases that it gets into. It talks about the Texas killing fields. It talks about, it talks about missing people, and it highlights 8 different people who are endangered and missing, and tells their story about their last known whereabouts. Then, chapter 5, there is something called Notorious Offenders, and it talks about this case that I actually don't have any interest in, which is that of Robert Durst. I suppose he was a famous, or at least wealthy real estate mogul in New York City, and his wife passed away. But to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't read this article. It's the only one I didn't read. That kind of high society, important people killing their wives, it's just a bummer. I didn't care. Obviously I feel bad for the wife. I'm not saying I don't care about her, but just, that kind of crime is not nearly as interesting to me. I guess I can't exactly pinpoint why crime is interesting to me at all, but it is. And there is an article about this. The name of the article is called Canada's Killer Santa, Monster in Disguise. And this is a serial killer case that I had never heard of. I guess this guy was a landscaper, but sometimes he worked as a mall Santa. And he killed quite a few men. And so I learned about that one. And then there was an article about Samuel Little, the super notorious serial killer with 93 victims, and the one who has been drawing portraits of his victims. So there's some portraits of victims and some details about that case. And then there was a article about Jennifer Delos, who was murdered by her wealthy husband, another one of those stories. I read this one though, and I guess the guy who probably killed her killed himself, so there's that one. And then the final section of the book is called, or rather the magazine is called Second Chances, and it talks about this man who murdered another person when he was 16 and spent 20 some odd years behind bars, and it talks about his release and how he's changed and so forth. So that's the end of the magazine, and I had a lot of fun reading it. I spread it out over quite a few days because, I mean, you can only read so much like true crime content in a row. In my opinion, I at least have to take a lot of breaks and just sort of digest it slowly. But yeah, so hopefully this has been a relaxing video to listen to. And if you liked this, please let me know so I can make more content like this. I hope that you enjoyed, and good night.